Before the Parthenon, before Sparta or Athens, before even the whispered songs of Homer, there were goats. Not marble ones, carved by sculptors. Not symbolic ones, praised in poems or slaughtered on altars. But real, bleeding, hungry goats with curling horns and an uncanny ability to escape any fence. And in the quiet valleys of what we now call Greece, long before it was Greece, when it was simply land and river and sky, goats were everything. They fed the children with their milk. They clothed the old with their hides. Their dung fertilized the fields. Their bones became tools, flutes, and lucky charms. To lose a goat was to lose warmth, sustenance, and even a bit of dignity. And so, when a goat went missing, people noticed. It begins in a village we'll call Doros, nestled in a cradle of hills that sipped dew from the morning fog. Mud-brick homes circled a central hearth, and life moved with the seasons. Planting, grazing, harvesting, storytelling. Doros was not alone. A half-day's walk east, over a ridge where thyme and wild garlic grew, was another village, Mechis. The people of Mechis had thicker beards, it was said, and sharper tongues. Their goats were leaner, meaner, and somehow always seemed to give more milk. For a time, the two villages shared a border of grasses and silence. There was no map, no line drawn in the dirt, but everyone knew where Doros ended and Mechis began, or so they believed, until one spring, the goats of Doros wandered too far. Or perhaps it was the goats of Mechis that wandered. No one could agree. What we know is this. A young boy named Kelios, son of a herder, brought back a goat with unfamiliar markings. His father, old Tharn, squinted at it, eyes failing, knees failing, but his pride intact. "This goat is ours," he declared. "See the notch on its ear. That's my mark." But the next day, a man from Mechis, tall and sunburnt, arrived in Doros with 3 companions and a quiet fury. His name was Naren, and his voice carried the salt of coastal winds. "That goat," he said, "belongs to my daughter." They argued, they gestured, they swore oaths by stars and springs. No one drew a weapon, not yet, but from that moment something shifted. What was once soft between the villages began to harden, like clay left in the sun too long. The early Bronze Age in Greece, what scholars call the early Helladic period, was a world on the edge of plenty. Life clung to rivers, to trade routes, to animal paths. Communities were small, scattered, and self-reliant. Water came from the hills or not at all. Rain meant full jars. Drought meant hunger. Goats, unlike cattle, could climb and graze where nothing else dared. They were the currency of resilience. In this world, ownership was not just about possession. It was about survival. Villages like Doros and Mechis had no kings, no fortresses, no priests chanting in palatial halls. Just elders with long memories, women with sharper ones, and animals who could not speak for themselves. But animals left trails, tracks in the mud, droppings on stones. And so disputes began, not just about one goat, but many, whose herd had grazed on whose grass, whose kids had broken whose fence. Each week, the arguments grew, and then the fences did too. Doros built a wall. Not much, just a waist-high ring of stones with woven brush to keep the goats in, or perhaps out. Mechis responded by stacking thorny branches along the ridge trail. A message, a line, a warning. The spring rains came, and with them, too many goats on too little grass. And then, one night, something burned. To this day, no one knows who lit the flame. Perhaps it was an accident, a cooking fire caught in the wind. Or perhaps it was vengeance. Some say it was Naren himself. Others whisper it was Tharn, old and brittle but filled with the anger of youth long gone. Whatever the cause, a barn in Mechis went up in smoke. No one died, but 10 goats did. A child's blanket, tucked in the hay, turned to ash. The smell of scorched hide lingered for days. Mechis responded not with words, but with a raid. At dawn, 6 men crossed into Doros. They didn't carry swords, those were rare, but they brought spears with flint tips and fists hardened by work. They smashed pottery. They drove off 2 goats. One man was struck with a stone and bled from his temple. It was not war. Not yet, but it was no longer peace. What followed was not like the wars of later Greece, not like the clash of hoplites at Marathon or the burning of Troy. There were no phalanxes, no strategies, no declarations. Just vengeance. Small, cutting, and constant. One week, a Doros boy disappeared, never found. The next, a Mechas well was poisoned with dung. Tit for tat. Grudge for grudge. Archaeologists, digging centuries later, would find burn layers in villages across the Peloponnese. Fortified house walls. Shattered pottery beneath collapsed roofs. Evidence of fire and flight. They would label it unrest. They would write in journals. Intercommunal conflict, likely due to resource competition. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was goats. Or pride. Or fear of going without. In those days, there lived a girl named Ira, from Doros. She was quick with her hands and kind with her voice. Her favorite goat was named Limu, and she sang to it as she milked. In Mechas, there was a boy named Pelin, with dark eyes and a crooked smile. He had once traded figs for a carved comb Ira made. They had met once, in a neutral meadow, and laughed. But laughter does not last long in the time of fear. One evening, as Ira grazed her goats near the old olive grove, she saw Pelin again, older now, wary, spear in hand. But he smiled. "You still sing to goats?" he asked. "Better to sing to them than to men," she replied. And they talked. Of trees, of mothers, of how tired everyone seemed. That night, Pelin returned to Mechas and left his spear at home. The next day, Ira passed her milk to a trader who brought it, quietly, to Pelin's grandmother. Small steps, and then someone saw, and the gossip spread like dry leaves in wind. In the months that followed, Doros and Mechas stood at the edge of true war. Spears were sharpened. Men trained with clubs and slings. A secret council in Doros debated attacking at night. But then the rains came early, and with them a flood. It swept through both villages, drowning goats, destroying huts, leveling fences. And in that moment of shared grief, something broke. Not a treaty, not a bargain, but the silence. Pelin found Ira again, this time not with a smile but with tears. "Help us," he said. "We have nothing left." And she did. So did others. The flood was nature's wrath, but it also washed away the anger. For a time, the villages rebuilt. Together, in parts. They shared wells. They married across lines. Not peace exactly, but something gentler than before. The land healed faster than the hearts. Floodwaters receded, revealing soil rich with silt and memory. Fields reborn. Trees leaning toward the sun. Their roots gripping stone like lovers afraid to let go. And amid the green, goats returned. Smaller herds this time, more carefully watched. Doros and Mechas stood like weathered statues across the valley, not quite facing each other, not quite turned away. But in that space between, where olive trees twisted skyward and bees worked in silence, there was Ira, and there was Pelin. They met often now, beneath a flat stone they called the listening table. No one else came there. It wasn't neutral ground, not officially, but it felt safe. Felt like before. "I think the land is tired of us," Pelin said once, as they sat watching the sky bruise with sunset. "No," Ira replied, "just tired of our anger." They traded news more than words. How many goats were born? Which grandmother had died? Who was sick? Who was dreaming again? Their peace was stitched together not with treaties, but with care. Sometimes they brought gifts. A carved spoon, a jar of honey, a song hummed softly. And then one day Pelin brought a goat. "Her mother died," he said. "She needs milk." I thought, maybe Limu could nurse her. Ira blinked. The kid bleated. Limu, now old and patient, sniffed the orphan and accepted her. So Ira nodded. She can stay. It was the first shared goat in the valley. But the world beyond Doros and Mechas did not sleep. To the south, past the ridge and across the stony coast, another village rose, Carthus, a place of traders and fishermen. They had seen the smoke from old raids. They had heard tales of burning barns and missing boys. And they had watched with interest. Carthus did not want war. They wanted goats. Specifically, they wanted the highland grazing routes Doros and Mechas claimed. Those cliffs where thyme and clover made the milk sweet, where winds kept flies at bay and predators seldom dared climb. So one day, under the pretense of trade, Carthus sent emissaries, gifted in speech and armed with news. To Doros they said, Mechas has formed a pact with pirates. To Mechas they said, Doros is preparing to seize the ridge. Neither was true, but both were believed, because trust, once broken, heals slower than wounds. Pelin heard the whispers first. Ira heard them echoed days later, and when they met at the listening table, they did not speak at once. The goat kid, now stronger, nuzzled between them. I don't want to lose what we have, Pelin said. Ira touched her forehead to his. Then let's make it more. It was Ira's idea. Gather the elders from both villages under one sky, on the neutral rock where the goats once grazed. Bring no weapons, she said. Only your stories. Many resisted. Old Tharn, near death now, spat on the idea. They took my son, he muttered. No goat or girl can fix that. But others remembered the flood, and the hunger, and the child who vanished and was never found. So they came, 10 from Doros, 11 from Mechas, 2 goats, 1 from each herd, and Ira and Pelin, standing not between, but beside them. No one knew what to say, until the oldest of Mechas, a woman named Isora, knelt and placed a stone on the ground. For every tale of loss, she said, let us lay a stone. And they did, for each burned home, for each stolen animal, for each vanished child. Pile grew, slow and solemn. Then Ira laid a stone and whispered, for every song still to be sung. Pelin added one more. For the goat we shared. The elders looked at each other, then down at the stones. They did not agree on everything, but they agreed to pause. If you sift through the earth in that valley today, you may find the bones of goats, scattered and sun-bleached. Perhaps a broken loom weight, a spindle whirl, shards of a jar once painted with tiny leaves and lines. But you won't find swords, because Doros and Mechas never escalated to iron. Bronze was rare, stone more common. But in the end, it was not weapons that shaped them, it was stories. Archaeologists call this era the transition from the early to the middle Helladic, a time when fortified settlements appeared across the Greek mainland, when trade expanded, when pottery changed from flashy to plain. They write of socio-economic shifts, of inter-settlement tensions, of defensive adaptations. But perhaps, in a valley forgotten by texts, peace was quietly chosen. Because of goats, because of a girl who sang, a boy who listened. And so, the first civil wars of the Greek world, if we dare call them that, did not end in glory. They ended in memory. The listening table became smooth with use. Generations carved names into its base. Songs were passed from mouth to mouth, like bread broken and shared. Somewhere, even now, the wind still whistles through olive trees where goats once grazed. And if you listen carefully, you might hear a bleat, or a lullaby, or the soft sound of history breathing. You are part of it now. Seasons turned like millstones. Rain came and went. Children were born, and elders faded into the soil they had once fought to defend. The valley no longer belonged to Doros or Mechas. It belonged to the quiet, to the sun, to the goats. Pelin married, not Ira, but another girl from Doros, Lenya, who made dye from crushed berries and sang lullabies that wandered like smoke. Ira, too, found love with a shepherd from Mechas named Diran, a man who spoke rarely but always smiled at clouds. Their lives never entwined in the way stories sometimes hope, but they never unwound either. Ira and Pelin still met, often with their families, on festival days or at market, and they always brought something to share: a song, a jar of olives, a story, a silence. And so, in a strange way, they raised the valley together, not with fire and blade, but with watching, with remembering. Children learned to skip stones where once warriors had crept. Old goats with gray coats wandered freely between herds, no longer branded for sides. And the listening table became more than stone. It became a custom, Each year, on the longest day of summer, the people of Doros and Mechis gathered there, not to argue, but to tell what they'd learned. One year, a child recited a poem about bees. Another, an elder played a song on a flute carved from bone. And every year, someone brought the oldest goat in the valley, garlanded with rosemary and thyme, and let it graze at the edge of the circle, unbothered and unimpressed by history. But time, like a river, forks. In one path, the valley falls to ruin. Raiders arrive. The fragile peace shatters. Pottery burns. Trees fall. In another, hours the valley holds. A band of pirates did come once. From the sea, lean and loud, their sails black with tar. They demanded tribute. Meat, silver, women. The people of Doros and Mechis sent goats. Not just any goats, thin, sour, wild-tempered beasts with more horn than sense. The pirates laughed, loaded them aboard, and sailed away. They did not return. Legends claim one of the goats chewed through a sail and another kicked a man into the sea. None of it was verified, but the people told the tale anyway, because stories, especially half-true ones, were what kept the valley warm. Centuries would pass before someone called the place Greece, before Homer sang of heroes and helms and hollow horses, before Athens rose like a question and Sparta answered with a shout. But even before all that, someone had to draw the first lines. In the valley, children began to draw. They sketched paths between the wells of Doros and the orchards of Mechis. They traced where goats wandered and where time bloomed strongest. They mapped the listening table and the shaded grove where berries ripened first. Their maps were not for war. They were for walking, for visiting, for remembering. And so, before anyone built a wall or raised a banner, these children had already carved unity into the earth. Not with conquest, but with chalk and curiosity. If you were to break open the hillside today, under centuries of stone and sleep, you might find a pot course, gray, undecorated. The Middle Helladic style, archaeologists say. Plain, practical, efficient. But look closer. Some pots are etched, not painted, but scored with care. Tiny goats, curved hills, a spiral that might be the listening table, a crescent moon, perhaps marking the day the peace began. These were not made for kings. They were made for kitchens, for milk, for hands. And that too is history. Not the battles, but the bread. Not the blood, but the baby cradled beside a fire. The lullaby hummed while beans boiled. It's easy to forget that the future was carried not by the sword, but by the pot. Helen grew old, Ira older still. They died in the same season, he in autumn, she in winter. Their families mourned separately but buried them in the same grove, beneath a tree that had once hidden goats from raiders. Their children tended that tree, and someday, their children's children carved a small bench beside it. Not a grave marker, just a seat, for sitting, for telling stories. A place to remember that the first Greek civil wars, if they were wars at all, may not have been about power, or land, or vengeance. They were about goats, and something deeper than goats, something we might call belonging, or misunderstanding, or the ache of needing what another has. But mostly they were about people. People who hurt, who healed, who handed songs to their children and whispered, "This is who we are." And now you, too, have heard the song. Let the goats roam in your dreams. Let the olive trees sway. The wars have ended, and the story is yours now. The cairn grew taller each passing year, not by design, but by instinct. What began with a pebble became a custom. By the time the traveler returned decades later, his beard silver, his staff smoother, he found a mound of memories. Small stones placed by children who didn't know the names of Doros or Mechis. A carved shell, a shard of pottery, a lock of hair bound in blue thread. He sat by the cairn until dusk, listening not for voices, but for the silence that follows stories, the hush between generations. And he left again not for war, but for wonder. In a scroll he would later write, he called the valley the place of quiet goats. Scholars debated the phrase for centuries. Was it metaphor, allegory? But perhaps it was just what it sounded like. A poet from across the Aegean came next. She walked barefoot through the groves and slept under fig trees. She wrote verses on bark and sang to the wind. One evening, by the listening table, she met a child who asked why she didn't carry weapons. "I carry questions," she said, and that was answer enough. Her poems never mentioned Doros or Mechas. Instead, she wrote of time-scented dreams, of the bleat of dusk, of old men carving names into spoons. But buried in the lines were echoes of stilled swords, of shared wells, of benches carved in memory of rivals who once dreamed of olive trees. Her verses spread far, not quickly, not like war stories, but slowly, like ivy, like forgiveness. One summer, a goat stood unmoving for a full day atop the listening table. People watched. They brought it grain and fig leaves. It did not eat. It simply stared toward the west. Young ones giggled and called it the stone goat. When it finally stepped down at sunset, the air felt softer. That night, dreams were longer, and the goats bleated sweeter. No one ever truly explained it. But from that year on, a goat was led to the table every summer solstice. Not as sacrifice, not as spectacle, just as presence. Centuries later, a new language arrived. One of straight lines and sharp syllables. It built columns and forums, and it demanded records. A scribe, tasked with cataloging minor valleys, came across a fading tale of a war over goats. He wrote, possibly fictitious, petty disputes, minor agricultural squabble, and moved on. But his apprentice, a girl who loved stories, copied the tale into her own scroll. She changed none of the facts, but softened the margins with sketches of goats with curled horns and children with chalk-stained hands. She named the valley Tranquillora. The name never caught on, but her scroll survived. 1,000 years later, a monk in a coastal monastery found it while looking for psalms. He read it thrice before bedtime. He wept, then he slept. In the modern age, satellites swept over the valley. No monuments, no ruins worth tourism. Just hills and goats and a peculiar circular stone formation that defied erosion. Historians debated. Was it a meeting place? A forgotten cult? A calendar? Theorists speculated wildly. Some claimed alien rituals. Others, sun-worshipping shepherds. But the goats, as always, cared little. They walked in ancient paths their ancestors had worn, hooves pressing into the very bones of old stories. And under the stars, those same indifferent stars that once watched Doros and Mechas trade blood for wool, children still skipped stones, still laughed, still shared. And perhaps, just perhaps, they carried forward something quieter than victory, something older than civilization, something warm. Today, in a museum tucked behind more famous halls of bronze helmets and painted amphorae, there sits a goat bell. It is dented, plain, unremarkable to most. The label reads, Bronze Age Bell, Middle Helladic, possibly ceremonial, recovered from an unfortified valley. No known city-state affiliation. But every so often, a visitor lingers longer. Not because of what the bell is, but because of what it almost whispers. The wars that may have started over goats ended in something stranger than peace. They ended in patience, in shared songs, in remembered silence, in valleys where shadows fall soft and the only thing sharper than a sword is memory. And if you sleep tonight beneath a tree or near a hill, or with a dream of distant lands, perhaps you'll hear it. Not the clash of blades, but the slow, steady echo of hooves. And in that echo, a story waiting not to be won, but simply to be told. Long after empires rose and crumbled, after roads stitched the world together only to fray again, a digital archive was born. Within it, amidst dry inventories and digitized frescoes, someone uploaded a scan of an ancient scroll. It bore no signature, no recognized provenance. Just an old story, badly translated, about goats. A young scholar, half exhausted, half curious, read it while sipping cheap wine. She laughed, then she cried, then she shared it. Within weeks, artists painted it. Musicians set verses to strings. Children in far cities made puppet plays of Doros and Mechas, of Ira and Pelin. The story became not truth, but comfort. A whisper passed through screen light, a lullaby carried by code. And somewhere in a valley still unmarked by any grand map, a goat nibbled wild mint, and the wind felt unusually kind. You stir in your sleep. Outside, the moon has tipped into shadow, and the night grows quieter still. You dream of two villages, two children, a war and its undoing. You dream of goats wandering freely between worlds, of cairns grown from pebbles, of hands reaching not to strike, but to share. And when you wake, maybe you will not remember the names, but you will remember the feeling that even when history sharpens its teeth, there can be a softness. Even when wars begin, stories can heal. And sometimes, just sometimes, peace bleats gently from a distant hill.